Welcome to the Politics of Information webinar series, organized by the Center for Access to Information and Justice, featuring speakers who research information, surveillance, power in the digital and pandemic age. The Center for Access to Information and Justice at UWinnipeg focuses on public interest research and the use of freedom of information in social science. Check out the CAGE website for more info. I'd like to acknowledge that University of Winnipeg is located on ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I acknowledge that our water in Winnipeg is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Thanks to the UW events team and media team for working on this webinar series. Here's the format for today. We have 75 minutes. We have our featured speaker. We'll have some questions from you in the audience. If you do have a question, just pop it into the Q&A tab and we will get to it after we hear from our featured speaker, Dr. Joshua Reeves, who is an associate professor in the School of Communication at Oregon State University. He's the author or co-author of 3 books on surveillance and media technology, including, most recently, The Prison House of the Circuit, Politics of Control from Analog to Digital. And he's also an associate editor at a journal, Surveillance and Society, and co-director of the Surveillance Studies Network. Thank you, Dr. Reeves, for being here today. I'll turn the floor over to you.
All right. Thanks a lot to Kevin and, of course, to CAGE for making this possible. I'm really excited. I've got some new projects I want to talk about today, and so this is really a great opportunity for me. How's that look for y'all? Okay, so the talk I'm going to give today is media escalation and new transparencies. And I hope that it'll give us some groundwork for talking about the directions in which my research has been heading for the past few years by focusing on a couple of theoretical themes that I'll get into in just a second. But media escalation is one of them, and then this question of the constant discovery of new transparencies, the imperative for the discovery of these transparencies. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And to get into this issue, what I would like to discuss is the relationship between new things becoming intelligible, between new transparencies and new politics. So if you look at von Leeuwenhoek's microscope, it's just this small mediological intervention that laid the groundwork for a lot of new ways of visualizing the world. And then, of course, by revisualizing the world, it remade the way in which we think of ourselves and of politics and how we should arrange our societies. Because, new media, like this microscope, they make new things intelligible. And part of that is making intelligible new threats. And so by making visible bacteria for the first time, it kicks off all kinds of political interventions. You get health and immunization campaigns, you get new methods of confinement and segregation, new ways for preserving and cleansing food and water, all kinds of health interventions and social and political interventions as well. So just by this small change in the way in which we see the world, it kicks off it has reverberations throughout the social and the political realms. So that's one thing that I'm really interested in is how do these new media technologies kick off some of these new ways of seeing and then living in the world? And that informs the approach that I'm taking to the past project, which I'm still working on, but a past book project, and then some of my new research, which I'll introduce at the end of the presentation. And these 2 basic theoretical frameworks are enclosure, and a lot of you will be familiar with this theoretical framework that's been in development for decades, but really kicked off by Mark Andrejevic and his work on the digital enclosure. And how I'm using enclosure is it's kind of like arrangements of technology and space that facilitate the analysis and control of the phenomena that are enclosed. All right, so you can think about this digitally, but you can also think about it in a traditional geographic sense where you use fences, but it's a way of working with space that makes intelligible And in making intelligible that space, it also opens it up for analysis and control. And then there's this other theoretical framework that we get from especially scholars like Friedrich Kittler in the German School of Media Theory, where media escalate independent of human plans, right? So it's a decentering of the human when trying to think about the impact of technology. And so media, from this point of view, they escalate in a competition of one-upmanship that resembles the way in which new military weapons advance in response to the developments made by one's competitors. So instead of relying on human ingenuity, what this model does is it says that media technologies really are able to instrumentalize human imagination and human ingenuity in such a way that media technologies advance more or less independent of human constructs and human plans, right? So it sets technology at the forefront of the conversation. And so when we talk about new methods of surveillance, new cultures of surveillance, how might media escalation change the conversation if we start to foreground the role of media technology in that discussion? So those are a couple of things that I've been thinking about, and the spaces at which these converge. It's really interesting to me. So, as I noted a minute ago, I'm really in this talk going to work through two, they're distinct projects, but they inform one another, of course. And the themes that bring them together are surveillance and media technology and knowledge production, the relationship between these things. And so in the book that I wrote, Killer Apps, with my co-author Jeremy Packer a few years ago, and that we had been really developing that work for about 10 years by the time that the book even came out. So it's been a line of thinking that we've been developing for quite a while. And the most basic question was, how do new media technologies make new enemies and threats perceptible, especially in the military? Or at least that's the portion of that project that's most relevant to this. So again, what I was introducing with the microscope earlier, how do these new mediological interventions allow us to see new things? And how does this especially relate to the revealing of new enemies or new threats, especially in the military, right? And then second, combined with this, and I'll get into this especially at the end of the presentation, is what are the conditions of enclosure that we have set up in order to disclose or quantify new realms of esoteric reality? And that sounds a little weirder than it really is, because I mean, the basic question is, how have we tried to set up enclosures in such a way, not just digital enclosures, there's a history there, but especially today, digital enclosures that disclose elements of reality that are not intelligible to the naked eye. I mean, so esoteric and hidden in that sense, right? How do we try to discover and then reveal new elements of reality, and then, of course, to quantify and oftentimes monetize those? So these are sort of the backbones of two larger, longer term projects. And the question of what brings them together, I think it's a recognition that media and technological environments change what is intelligible, and that media escalation constantly drives new transparencies by revealing new realms of reality that need to become transparent. Right? So what's that relationship between media escalation constantly improving our capacity to discover new realms of reality, and then that driving a desire, primarily via that mechanism of media escalation, in order for us to discover new and new and new and new and newer realms of reality, to drive to make them transparent. So those are the questions that I'm going to be focusing on today. Now, just to give you an illustration of what I'm talking about in the military realm, we can think about the work that air defense systems do, and defense systems in the military more generally, as an enclosure, right? As an enclosure of space. And air defense systems, satellites, drone aircraft, signals intelligence, this entire apparatus of military data processing, together, all of these technologies, they open up new domains of intelligibility. And so in that sense, via the conceptual vocabulary of the enclosure, I mean, they enclose this domain of reality. They subject it to visibility and analysis. And then in some cases, of course, which is what we're interested in the book, I mean, how then do we empower artificial intelligence to make decisions based on those data, about when to engage enemies, for example, or certain threats, if it's a missile defense system. And ultimately, as I think we can understand in the context of the drone, that it shows us enemies we didn't even know we had, right? So there are media technologies that, by disclosing reality in a particular way, in, let's say, a slice of reality that was previous to that unintelligible to us, it shows us enemies that we didn't even know existed. All right. So just like the microscope, it changes our political intelligibility. So it shifts the plane of politics. So what's the importance of that? That's one of the things that I'm interested in exploring in my research, and that we do go into in great depth in killer apps. And so, of course, this is absolutely crucial to where we find ourselves today in this current stage of military development. We have the revolution of military affairs, which is it's a way that over the past several decades, the military has been completely remade. And everything has been subordinated to emerging technologies like precision targeting and network computing, satellite geopositioning, especially drone warfare, right? And so we have about 10 years ago, our Deputy Defense Secretary observing that the cutting edge, the most expensive project in military history, the F-35, he said it's not a fighter plane, it's a flying sensor computer that sucks in an enormous amount of data, correlates it, analyzes it, and displays it to the pilot on his helmet. Okay, so that's pretty remarkable, is that this massive zone of investment is more or less a surveillance device, right? It's a flying surveillance technology. And so what essentially you get with revolution in military affairs is that you have a media-driven kind of war. And in Russia and Ukraine, which I think is really the best example of this kind of war completely dominates current tactics. So you can imagine, I don't know if y'all are able to watch any of the mapping channels or any of the maps that folks are distributing, keeping up with the front lines and then keeping up with what's going on in the Donbass, especially. But so many of the advances are relying on drone warfare, right? So we've really seen the emergence of what we thought we had seen sort of peak drone warfare in North Africa and the Middle East and in Central Asia over the past several years. Now we've definitely seen a new level of this in a more conventional war environment. So in any case, to help us understand what this does, I mean, insofar as this is related to enemy epistemology, you take a place like the mountains of Afghanistan, for example, and these, let's say the F-35 or drones, whatever it happens to be, is that it provides political data, that it is overviewing the battle space, it is overviewing, again, realms of previously esoteric reality, and it's enclosing them, right? It is providing a mechanism by which we can understand and make intelligible and then analyze that environment, right? So we're talking about the military being increasingly preoccupied with developing mechanisms of enclosure, right? Developing new mechanisms of surveillance and enclosure. So one of the things that I want to work out here a little bit is military enclosure as a sort of dehumanizing process. And I don't mean this in the sense that people typically say dehumanizing, but I think that as I work through it, you'll understand what I'm going for. If you think through what Kittler says about the digital telos, I mean, he says that because war is noisy, command in war must be digital, right? It must be completely clear. It must be a 0 or a 1. It can't be analog. There can't be ambiguity. There has to be clarity. And that's rooted in digital technology. That's a digital impulse, right? To be able to reduce all phenomena to friendly or enemy, right? And as those of you who are familiar with Kittler will know, that he works from Shannon and Weaver, especially Shannon, right? But working upon this communication model where communication systems achieve optimal results by creating extensive feedback loops that get rid of noise in the channel, right? And so we have this drive to get rid of as many sources of noise as we possibly can in the communications channel. And this is obviously imperative, perhaps most of all, in the military. And what this brings us back to is the dehumanizing process, because what is the primary cause of noise? It's humans, and it's their need for messy semiotic systems, their inability to transmit and process data quickly and perfectly. Humans fundamentally are media technology's main obstacles to producing flawless data circulation. So if we think about the drive toward artificial intelligence and autonomy in the military, the human becomes a problem to get over, right? So how do we accomplish that by the development of surveillance technologies? How do we get rid of the human? So what we call this is it's a variant of anthropophobia, which you can see all over military discourse. I mean, it's not just in military discourse. I mean, I think that this is a byproduct of the digital in general, right? But we see a growing distaste for the human's innate vulnerabilities and weaknesses, especially vis-a-vis the figure of the machine, right? And these tend to be a distaste for the biological deficiencies of humans. You see it in labor. If you look at the history of especially industrialization, I mean, humans are costly. They need a salary and health insurance. They need air conditioning. They need, a living wage. They need all these kinds of things. Wouldn't it be nice if we could replace them with machines that don't require all this care, right? And of course, in the military, you see this with a slightly different twist, right? Where human soldiers have soft and brittle bones, right? They have delicate flesh. They're susceptible to trauma. And so they will, according to at least some military experts, necessarily be an inferior soldier to a fully robotic soldier, or an an artificially intelligent soldier. So we see General Gordon Johnson of the U.S. Joint Forces Command speaking to this effect, where he said the AI weapon systems, they don't get hungry, they're not afraid, they don't forget their orders, they don't care if the guy next to them has just gotten shot. Will they do a better job than humans? Yes. Right. So this is the full logic of anthropophobia, right? So the way in which I'm most interested in this problem in anthropophobia is that this is an epistemological question, right? If you look at that list of things that humans don't do as well as AI weapon systems, a lot of them are epistemological in nature, that they focus on data capture and knowledge production. They're not afraid. They don't forget their orders. They don't care if somebody got shot. This is a question of data processing, right? Of data capture and knowledge production. And so humans, because of the military environment, are just inferior to machines that don't have to worry about their friends getting shot. And, are they hungry, and is their mind on something else? Are they lost in prayer, or whatever it happens to be, right? Um, so I think that this, as the human as providing an epistemological obstacle, we can see it in pre-digital times, as I note here, going back to Clausewitz's fog of war. I mean, oftentimes the humans and the need for humans to communicate with one another is what creates the fog of war. But there is this understanding that, man, if we could just sort of get over the human in certain ways, it would make things a lot easier and a lot clearer. So in the military, then, to sum up, I mean, to enclose is ideally to dehumanize, to return to Shannon and Weaver. I mean, removing noise from the chain of perfect communication, of perfect circulation, requires eliminating this most basic enemy of data processing. Even developing, I think this is important, this is sort of crucial, the whole thing, developing means of communication and surveillance of data processing that humans can't participate in. So just for example, with aerial fueling, a human pilot, a flesh and blood pilot, can stay in the air only about 12 to 14 hours, right? But drones can stay in the air for 40 to 50 hours. And above 65,000 feet, humans' blood boils, right? So there are certain tasks that the human body prevents them from doing. This is sort of reminiscent of Dr. Strangelove. If you remember when Major Kong, he's in the B-52 bomber with the atomic bomb, and the orders to not drop the bomb can't reach him, right? So they've constituted this level of communication that's beyond the capacity of the human to decode, all right? So it's a kind of funny illustration of this, about how the ideal military surveillance and communication system is constituted beyond the epistemological capacity of the experiencing human. All right, that's the sort of ideal setup, uh, is to create a system that humans just can't participate in, right? And so again, that's sort of the drive to digitize in the first place. That's a language that we can't speak. So to recapitulate a little bit what I've been developing over the past few minutes with this question of military enclosures, is that new transparencies have political effects. And new military technologies like drones, they don't just represent the territory they cover. I think it's a pretty basic theoretical point. What they do is they reveal new domains of political reality. For example, the drone, they will discover enemies or terrorists we never knew that we had. All right. And what I think is even more important about this is that this is a recursive process, right? These drones, on all media technologies, right, that change the kind of intelligibility that we have in our, they remake our field of intelligibility. They also disclose their own epistemological limitations, right? Because it's like, oh, we could see this particular enemy, but we couldn't see into the cave, just for example, you know. They disclose new epistemological limitations, which fuels the development of new media technologies, you know, more sophisticated image processing systems, just for example, to overcome those limitations, which then reveal just more limitations that have to be overcome by new mediological interventions. All right, so this is a recursive process. It's not like you ever are satisfied with the amount of data that you have. So new surveillance technologies, they shift our epistemological field and they disclose new threats, new enemies, new phenomena in general. Enclosure, therefore, reconstitutes reality rather than simply capturing or representing it. Okay? So that's what I want us to take with us from this little discussion of the military. All right. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the themes from this project, and I mean, y'all know how this is when you um, look at some of the discrete pieces of research that you've written, and you have to write a summary or a narrative of it for promotion or for whatever it is, a biography. You have to think about the ways in which these things fit together. And a lot of times you'll look at individual pieces of research, you'll be like, it's not exactly clear how this fits with this and fits with this and fits with this. But I mean, obviously, even if certain pieces of research are produced over the course of a number of years, they're influenced by a number of theoretical commitments or, you know, personal experience, all these different things. And so this is a distinct project, but it's coming from similar concerns. And so I'd like some feedback on this project, how y'all think it fits, and what are those important points of potential crossover. So experimental enclosures. That's the sort of basic thing that I'm working on right now. And I've been working on it for a couple of years, so it's not like it's a brand new project, but it's not out yet. In any case, the basic question that fuels this is something we discussed a moment ago relative to drones, is when will Google or, you know, the United States military decide that it has enough data? And as we can understand, that's a pretty ridiculous question. The United States military will never say, oh, we got all the data we need. We don't need any more, right? Google is never going to be like, oh, we got everything. We got it figured out. We're good. That's just not how things work, right? The enclosure wants to enclose everything, right? So we can't imagine a limit due to media escalation, the logic of capital. So we have a constant push to reconstitute the perceptible, to disclose and enclose more and more things. And this gets us back to that question of esoteric reality I was talking about earlier. How do we discover things that were previously hidden, right? And so thinking about this question led me to ask, you know, what are the activities, the realms of experience, the qualities, the biological processes, all of these things that we think resist enclosure and quantitative reduction, right? And so I was thinking about these general categories. What are those things that we think can't quite be quantified, that resist, for whatever reason, quantitative reduction? And so, you can think about these different realms of experience or these different activities: religion and spirituality and love and sex. And I ask my students this, and they're like, oh, going for a swim or something like this. So you think about these basic realms of experience that we, for whatever reason, still at this stage of the digital development, still think that we need to experience them, not necessarily with our smartphones, right? That there is something profound or ineffable about them that is important for us to not reduce quantitatively. And so the project started about thinking about all of these, again, spirituality, religion, sex, all this kind of stuff, but then realized it was a little bit unwieldy. And my writing partner, Ethan Stoneman, and I focused on a couple of specific examples of this. And this is an I'm not sure how I feel about the title. Y'all can tell me what you think, but we're calling it Vital Signs: Cultural Techniques of the Undead. And we're focusing mostly on vitality. And I'm not sure that we'll stick with that conceptual vocabulary of vitality, but I think it'll become obvious why we're choosing this in a second. So we've got a couple of things coming out, I think later this year, in Theory, Culture, and Society, and Theory and Event, and that lay the theoretical foundation for this new book. And that main question, again, is how have we enclosed and attempted to quantify life and vitality? How have we theorized and then tested the boundaries between life and non-life? Right. So that's the big question that's lying at the center of this new project. And so there are two different ways in which we're interested in exploring this. And the book is, 2/3, three-quarters written. I mean, so we've been thinking about this for a long time. We've got a lot of prose, but so you can think about how we've tested the limits of life to try to quantify that very moment at which we die, right? And so there are a number of fields of research that have done this. Bioastronautics, for example, the research that went into cardiac and brain death, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, vivisection experiments that have been carried out, really to see, how much pain can a particular organism undergo until it dies, or how much oxygen can be deprived from a particular animal or human until it dies. How can we mess with someone's blood pressure until they die? How do you quantify that moment at which it happens? How do you carry out experiences on life in order to try to understand exactly that moment at which life no longer exists, right? So that's one aspect of it. And the other is bypassing subjectivity. So you can see why we're calling it vitality, because we're struggling in a sense to come up with a better word that encapsulates both of these things. That we have the quantification of the end of life, and then also bypassing subjectivity, right? So it's a question also of consciousness. So not just pushing life to its extremes in order to quantify that moment at which life slips into death, but also how do we bypass subjectivity? How do we experiment on when someone is fully conscious or not? Right. So we have experiments in torture and mind control, in spiritual transcendence. We talk, for example, about confession and the way in which in the Roman Catholic Church, there were confessionals that are actually enclosures, right? So the enclosure vocabulary fits quite neatly into this. They call it a dark box for a reason, because it's supposed to enclose you in a particular kind of epistemological environment that allows you to empty yourself of your consciousness and speak the truth, right? So it's supposed to be, in essence, an emptying of subjectivity and allowing you to just channel truth, right? So those are the kinds of things we're interested in. Anesthesia as well. So how are we able to bypass subjectivity? How do we, measure consciousness vis-a-vis unconsciousness, and how do we sort of ride that boundary between them? That's what I'm interested in, especially right now. Um, so I'll just give a quick example of this. I'm not going to go into too much depth in this project, but you'll see the encyclopedists characterized death in a particular way, right? So we're talking about the middle of the 18th century. And pay attention to this sort of organic approach to life and death. So the encyclopedist wrote, birth is but a step toward this destruction of life. At the moment the fetus is formed, bodily life does not yet exist or is almost nothing. Little by little, life increases and extends. It acquires substance as the body grows, develops, and gains strength. And as soon as it begins to decline, the quantity of life diminishes. Finally, when it becomes bent, dry, and collapses, life withers, contracts, and is reduced to almost nothing. We begin to live by degrees and we finish dying like we begin to live. So death, this striking change of state, which is so feared, is in nature, in reality, only the last nuance of a previous being. Life starts to be extinguished long before it goes out completely. And in fact, there is perhaps a greater distance from old age to youth than from decrepitude to death. So we have this organic understanding of life where it starts at a particular stage and then increases and then decreases to the extent that there is not necessarily a larger difference between a dying body and a dead body than there is between a dying body and a young body, right? That it's that organic of a conception, right? And this is obviously something quite different from what we have today. So I was interested in the question of how do we get out of this organic conception of death? How do we start to enclose death in a way that reduces it to digitality, right? And so this is not quite what we look at in the book, but if you check out this table, there were a lot of y'all will be familiar with some of these soul measuring experiments that were carried out in order to understand the weight of the soul. Really, what they're measuring is death. How does the weight of the body change upon death? So it's to quantify, again, not just the soul, but life itself. And this, I think, is interesting because it gives us something, it illustrates the stark difference from the middle of the 18th century to the beginning of the 20th century. This understanding of death as being organic in the 18th century to all of a sudden being digital, to where death is a moment, where it's an instance. Okay. Um, so let me read to you something very uh, quickly here. Trying to move this a little bit so I can read to you a quick passage of this. So, as we write, in 1907, a doctor in Massachusetts ran a series of experiments to reveal the moment of death. For this doctor, Duncan McDougall, the temporality of death was actually a spatial question. It's unthinkable, asserted Dr. McDougall, that personality and consciousness, continuing personal identity, should exist and have being and yet not occupy space. Since therefore it is necessary to the continuance of conscious life and personal identity after death that they must have for a basis that which is space occupying substance, personality, or a continuing conscious ego after bodily death is unthinkable. And so McDougall, of course, is attempting to measure and scientifically classify something like a secularized version of the soul, a quantifiable chunk of what he calls gravitate matter that clings to the body until the moment of death. Therefore, according to McDougall, death could be determined through a series of experimental measurements that sought to capture the weight of this space occupying substance. And he says, since, however, the substance considered in our hypothesis is linked organically with the body until death takes place, it appears that it must be some form of gravitate matter and therefore capable of being detected at death by weighing a human being in the act of death. So McDougall set out on a campaign of media technology experimentation to discover and enclose this matter and to make it intelligible and measurable with new scientific measurements and instruments. All right. So he's carrying out all of these different experiments on tuberculosis patients. He likes to find them right before they die. And I could discuss this in greater depth, but I'll go ahead and move along. What this does is it starts to show how death becomes an exact moment. And this is illustrated, I think, in a development throughout the 20th century where we have this scientific conception of death that becomes digital. And I think one of the more interesting illustrations of this is our preference throughout the latter decades of the 20th century to um, to develop a brain conception of death, a neurological conception of death, as opposed to cardiac death. Because cardiac death can be sensed, right? It can be heard, it can be felt by a human examiner. That's the key thing, right? Is the human examiner. If we remember the bias of the digital against the human, right? So death, according to digital logic, it has to be constituted beyond the sensorial realm of humans. Its determination is surrendered to digital technologies, and in particular, like encephalography, that uncovers and encloses neurological activity and transforms it into a domain of political reality. That means it turns it into a domain of political intervention, right? That we can start toying with it in certain ways. So what this means is that death is not like a cycle. It's not like an organic development. What it is instead, death becomes an exact moment, an instant. The passage from life to death becomes digital. And as you can see from this scan down on the bottom, it's very clear. Death happens at a particular time, right? And so this is a digital conception in the sense that it's a 0 versus a 1. It's not a sort of slow development. It's not analog. It's not, well, this person's sort of alive and this person's sort of not alive at the moment of death. No, what happens is that you're a 0, you're alive, and then in an instant, you become a 1. You become dead, right? And so the question for me of how this process unfolded via technologies of enclosure, of trying to understand what, again, was seen by previous generations to be ineffable or sort of constitutively incomprehensible. The experiments that we'll carry out with new media technologies in order to domesticate them and digitize them, I think it's an interesting question. That's what we're exploring. So let me go ahead and wrap up. Some of the takeaways, I mean, there's a lot, right? But trying to pull these two paths of research together and thinking about what they can teach us and what we might be able to discuss is, digital technology pre-processes reality and presents reality back to us as digital, as knowable and quantifiable. So it has very real biases that it discloses to us in the picture of reality that it gives back to us, that it presents to us. And so that's something for us to think about is that, digital technologies bias for the quantifiable becomes then the way that we look at the world, right? And what are the potential problems of us having a largely quantitative view of the phenomena around us? In the logic of escalation, also, it ensures the inexhaustibility of new objects and methods of enclosure. So again, it's this question of recursivity that media technologies will disclose new things, and in disclosing those new things, it will also disclose new things that need to be discovered. And and then when we try to fix those new things that need to be discovered, it will simply disclose new things that need to be discovered and fixed, et cetera. And so there is this is an ongoing process, right, of discovery. And in the military, what this means is that new enemies will always be created and revealed. In medical research, this means that new threats or new enemies or whatever will always be created and revealed. The question for me, again, it's a sort of political and social question, but it's something that, I talk to my students about, I talk to my friends about, what is this larger impact of us losing more and more of these esoteric events, of these things that are hidden, of this value that we assign to the ineffable, of those things that can't be enclosed and quantified, as new enclosures encroach increasingly on these events, these activities, these connections, and we lose them to quantification and monetization and enclosure. What are we also losing? So those are some of the big political takeaways for me as well. So that's what I got. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. And so everyone in the audience, if you have questions, what you can do is you can put them into the little tab that says Q&A. There, you should see it in the very bottom. I'm going to try putting something into the chat as well, and I'm going to see if this works. I'd like to put the links to the books of Dr. Reeves into the chat here. Can everyone see that first one? I'll put a few more in there as we go along. Okay. So I had a couple questions, and again, if people in the audience have a couple questions, feel free to jump in. Uh, in the work on killer apps and the digitization of military interventions, there's this focus you mentioned on like uh, getting rid of human decision making, getting rid of human normativity. And I'm just wondering, in your research, have you also found some ways where there still is uh, bias written into a code or like racialized classifications written into a code? Are there ways that some forms of discrimination or bias still make it into these very dehumanizing technologies and processes?
Yeah, I mean, my goodness, that's a great question. I think that is one of the key questions that people are interested in asking at this stage of algorithmic intelligence. And we've got a lot of really great scholars who are going into those. I mean, Noble. I mean, we know the ways in which people have been analyzing this. And one of the things that Packer and I were doing in this project, and we got pushback on this from our reviewers, just to be frank with you, is that we were trying to imagine what if someone had challenged us to think about these problems without any of the conventional humanistic political concerns. And so we intentionally set out to not think about the questions of bias in algorithms, for example, because for us, we said, okay, these are obviously issues. And this is what we talk about in the book. We're like, okay, these are serious concerns. And a lot of surveillance and media studies scholars, a lot of other people have looked at these things and have pointed out their importance. And we said, okay, if our project is to center the role of media technology in these developments, then how do we think about human biases, right? Where are the human biases coming from and how central are they? So we had to go back and rethink our basic theoretical commitments because what we had given throughout the manuscript was a more or less technological determinist account of this thing, to where the humanistic concerns that we get about these things, according to that account, derive from technology, right? And so that the ways in which we like to conceive of problems between humans, the ways in which inequity affects folks, that this is derived from technology, that it's not reflective necessarily of human decisions or human biases, that this is something that's sort of inherent to the technology itself. And so that was a question that really threw us for a loop. And I'm not sure that we came up with a good answer for it. And maybe that's why you're asking the question, because you read Killer Apps and you saw our attempt to deal with this in the introduction, where we're dealing with, you know, feminist and critical race scholarship that are talking about the biases of algorithms, and that they're talking about the disparate impacts of these particular technologies on different groups. And we finally had to say, well, yeah, I mean, obviously, this is something that's absolutely crucial to understanding where we are in the digital age. That being said, if we foreground the role of humans in this, then we miss some of these larger questions that we forced ourselves to ask by thinking about the problems of automation and artificial intelligence and the way that they strive at least to deep six the human, right? And so that presents a certain tension between the fact that humans have to design these technologies, you know, algorithms come from human creativity to a certain degree, while also recognizing or at least in our project, trying to foreground the role of technology in determining what the humans would do to a certain degree in the first place, right? So it brings up a certain ambiguity about the role of algorithms and really any kind of human input and any kind of human political decision that could be made. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good way of wrestling with the criticism from some theoretical perspectives, but I know that the perspective that you adopted, you wanted to ask a certain kind of question, which is not often asked
It,
primarily. Yeah,
Yeah, and as we were writing it, we're like, I'm not, we had to come back to ourselves and say, do we really buy this? Is this just us pushing the theoretical envelope? And so I mean, these are questions for us in trying to confront the predominant humanist conceptions of algorithms and artificial intelligence, and so it was a difficult question for us. And so the best we could do, I think, was to acknowledge and then discuss that literature and say, here's what other folks have said about how important these things are. And we obviously agree, but here is I think in many ways, complementary perspective that also foregrounds the role of technology in sort of constituting the political, right?
yeah. Okay, here's a couple of questions. So the first one I'll go to here is about doing research on military research and development research technologies. And so especially important when you have like automated decision making in a robot or a drone or something. How do you get inside of that process? So the person asks, how difficult is it to inquire and find out about the new technologies being used by the military in your research?
What a great question. Um, as with a lot of digital tech developments, I mean, you know that these things, oftentimes we don't see what the cutting edge is, and that's especially true in the military. That in a time of relative peace, oftentimes we don't know exactly what the cutting edge of military technology is, and we understand a lot of that's going to be in classified projects that we don't have access to. And so we understood that at the beginning, that we are going to have to do our best with publicly available materials to find out what's actually going on. And so we would look for reports wherever we could. We obviously read military specialist publications for years. We kept up with, the grants that were being given out. I mean, those were the kinds of methods that we had to use in order to uh, keep up as best we could with the developments in military technology. But it's not perfect. I mean, we understand that, especially with the pace at which things are developing. My goodness, I mean, we published the book in 2020. Um, Things continue to escalate, as I was saying. I mean, if y'all are interested in this question of military, you should look at the different map bloggers, the different folks who are keeping up with the maps and are organizing the different strikes and the different things that are going on in Ukraine and Donbass right now. It's really, really interesting because that allows you to see it in real time. I feel like this is the first military conflict where, I mean, the way in which a lot of these front maps are being developed is because the Ukrainian military, for example, will put out a geolocated video of how they destroyed a Russian tank on the front. And so the mappers will take that geo data and then they'll say, okay, well, the Russians must obviously be here now, right? And so they're using the geolocative data based upon drone strikes in order to move the map of the front line. So it's really extraordinary. We've got real time. Um, I mean, we can talk about military research all we want, which is a lot of what Jeremy and I did in Killer Apps. But when you get to see the technologies that are used every single day, then that can disclose a lot. And so we've got a lot of access to a real time military conflict right now, and I think that's the best way to maybe be on the cusp of what's happening in military, if not research, at least in what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a question about the newer work and under the vital signs uh, heading. And you had a turn of phrase when you were talking about it that I think actually connects the two. you mentioned the surrender to the digital,
Yeah.
and in the enclosure as dehumanization killer app work, we all kind of collectively surrender to the digital, the digitization of the military, of uh, government as well. And then
Mhm.
with the vital signs work, you have to surrender to the digital in even the most intimate processes of life and death. Uh, so I'm just wondering if this is kind of a general question, but can you offer an explanation as to why today we are so, as humans, like easily resigning ourselves or surrendering to the digital, as you put it?
Why?
Why? Yeah,
Yeah, it's that's the big question, right? Maybe that's the fundamental question. As a media studies scholar, I think about this all day. I talk to my students about it all day, and I don't have a great answer. I mean, I think the at least the answer that I would give in a preliminary fashion is the one that I was gesturing toward a moment ago, is that, media determine our situation, is that they they set out before us things that we will like. They determine our patterns of behavior. They determine our values. They determine even things like political values. I do think that technology sets out before us a particular path, and that we ultimately have less influence over those things than we might like to imagine that we do. And so my answer to that question would say that, why do we give so much rein to the digital? Is because the digital wants us to give rein to the digital. And so the digital has turned us into the kinds of people that surrender to the digital, if that makes sense. And so we have become the people that want to digitize everything because the digital wants to digitize everything. And so it has remade us, right? It has ontological implications.
yeah,
What do you think? I mean, I don't know. I mean, again, that that also stems from that sort of anti-humanist position that Jeremy and I developed in Killer Apps. But I think if you look at, again, that fundamental question, why are we doing this?
yeah,
It seems to point toward, at least from my perspective, that the digital wants it to be digitized, right?
yeah,
So we have become those kinds of people in response to the demands that digital technology has put on us.
yeah. Our interests, our desires, our politics have already been kind of groomed or manicured by these processes before we even arrive to a consciousness of them.
Right, right. Again, that's what I was talking about earlier. Like, reality has been pre-processed by digital technology for us, right? Everything is already digitized before we experience it.
Yeah,
So, I think that's a key stage of this development, is that everything's already digital, right?
yeah. In the vital signs work, when you're bringing the enclosure framework to thinking about these other moments, these ineffable moments of life and death, um, can you say a little bit about how that theoretical move of bringing the enclosure work to that maybe differs from the surveillance capitalism uh, uh, work, Zuboff and others, that they're also kind of interested in how, like, your fridge and your TV are already listening to you and trying to feed you ideas about how to live or how to be healthier or whatever, uh, in ways that are really like uh, already permeating every second of your private life or your intimate life. So, can you say a little bit about how your approach might take a few different steps, or how it's a little bit different than the Zuboff approach?
Well, I should say that I'm obviously indebted to Zuboff in a lot of ways. I'm sure a lot of the ideas that I've developed have, are due to things that I've read in her work. I think what she does is terrific. I would say that, again, the difference in approach would be one, in sort of fundamental theoretical principles, where Zuboff provides us an economistic view of why these things are developing like they are, that she lays this at the feet of capital, right? That's to me, a sort of standard structuralist Marxist account, in a lot of ways. And again, I have sympathies with that reading in a lot of senses. Like I think that it gets at it discovers a lot of things that my work also would discover. If we were to look at the same things, we would see a lot of the same issues. But if there is a difference, if you focus on enclosure, especially if you put it with if you pair it with media escalation and that German media theoretical outlook, um, the question for me would not be how is capital driving this, but how is media technology allowing capital to look at the world in a particular way, right? So that media technology is always prior to capital and that it discloses the world for capital to devour in particular ways. And so it's not the logic of capitalism for me that is fundamental, whereas I think it is for Zuboff, right? It's again a sort of economic approach to this question, but it's a technological issue that technology discloses the world and it makes certain ways of piecing together reality um, possible. And so one of those ways is that Marxist approach that Zuboff describes so brilliantly. Um, Whereas for me, I would foreground the role of technology and media escalation, not necessarily saying that this is due to the logic of capital having to capitalize on everything. I would prefer that the enclosure has to enclose everything, right? That this is a mediological or a technological impulse there is an epistemological imperative that media technologies have, and that these these developing realms of enclosure are due to the imperatives that the epistemological imperatives that we see that are coming from technological development, media escalation itself. So, regardless of what kind of economics is underlying this, I think that media escalates in a particular way, independent of the logic of capital. So again, that's giving her due, but also thinking that I think just fundamentally, I think she would just emphasize the role of the economic more than I would, because I'm more interested in the question of technology and media escalation. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a great question. I've thought about it a million times.
I also wanted to ask a question about how the digitization of military technology and the kind of way of encoding reality as, friend or enemy, 0 or 1, that you find in that, how it's spilling into other domains of social control, and what some of the problems with that are, like policing, like private security. Are there any examples where you found it's spilling into these other domains where the friend enemy or 0 1 dichotomy, it it itself is not as intelligible because of other laws or rights that it butts up against?
Yeah, man, what a good question. I think that we're dealing here, if you think about zeros and ones, that we're looking at a logic of quantification, and that this has been a problem since the later 19th century in our bias toward having to quantify all social ills and then personifying those quantifications, oftentimes racializing them, so that we come to understand certain people as threats, and that those threats can be decoded through surveillance and analysis of the population. And that once we code for, certain things that we take for granted as being important, like racial background or national background or whatever it happens to be, that then we can quantify someone's threat, right? And those relative quantifications of threat then produce enemies, right? And so, I mean, this is one of the things that Foucault taught us about the internal enemy is that our societies thrive on the production of domestic enemies, and that we're not that it sort of disrupts that logic of just having international enemies where it's just us versus them. The us must necessarily contain a them, right? And so we have this bias toward the production of an internal enemy as well. And I think that comes along with the rise of, my goodness, I mean, the human sciences in general, but especially the quantification and racialization of the human sciences is a way that we can see that. And so the way that statistics permeate everything that we do, from racialized policing practices, I mean, all of the things that we already know about it as surveillance scholars, that we see this sort of reverberate throughout so many of the policing projects that characterize contemporary neoliberal policing methods, um, to the ways that we deal with domestic terrorists or domestic extremists or whatever it happens to be. The way that we quantify and understand internal threats, I think, is certainly tied up with the digital, with the numerical, with the friend and enemy distinction in general. That's a great question. I've got you on mute, I think, Kevin.
Well, yeah, sorry about that.
No.
There aren't any other questions in the chat here, um, but yeah, if anyone does have one last question they want to put out there, we still have time. If anyone wants to check out the books that Dr. Reeves has worked on, you can see the links there, I hope, in the chat, and also the link to Surveillance and Society, which is a journal where a lot of these kinds of discussions are happening.
I put my email address in the chat. If anybody wants to reach out to me with questions, I'm happy to continue these conversations.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. Well, I didn't have any other questions that popped up for me, so I guess I would thank you again. Thanks very much, Dr. Reeves, for being here. Thanks for sharing your work with us. And yeah, I would invite everyone in the audience to check out the books and the other work of Dr. Reeves.
Kevin, this is terrific. I had a great time. Thank you for the wonderful questions, and of course for extending this generous opportunity to talk with you folks. Best of luck, and thanks again. If I can ever return the favor, I hope you'll let me know.
Okay, for sure. Yeah. All righty. Well, thanks everyone for being here. Everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks
Everybody
again.
in the chat, I appreciate it. Y'all take care.